if you look at the history going back, Ford lost 2 years later to Jimmy Carter in the presidential contest, largely because of the suspicion of that pardon. And there was really very strong feeling and polling and articles and columns and editorials that Ford should not have done this. And so 25 years later, I undertook one of my projects, a book that became called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate in the presidencies of Ford through Clinton. And I called Ford up wanting to interview him about this, being pretty certain he would not talk and say, you know, I have a golf tournament or something like that. And but I called him and he said, oh sure, I'll be happy to talk to you. He was in New York at that first call, so I went up to New York. He was at a board meeting and interviewed him about the pardon and the sequence, his motivation. Again, with the luxury of time, I had 2 assistants who read all of the newspaper magazine coverage of the pardon, went to the Ford Library, got the legal memos. I interviewed everyone who was involved, who was still alive, interviewed them again, went to Ford's house in Colorado, interviewed him there a couple of times, interviewed him 3 or 4 times at his main house in Rancho Mirage, California. Doing drafts, asking that question, what really happened here behind the scenes? What was the driver? What was the motive? And in the last interview with Ford, I remember asking him, why did you pardon Richard Nixon? And he said, well, you keep asking that. And I said, well, I don't think you've answered it. And he said, okay, I will answer it. And these, I tell you, these are the moments you live for in my business, when somebody's kind of worn down and they say, I'm going to tell you what really happened. And Ford said, you've got to go back to that time in 1974. The economy was shaky. It was the middle of the Cold War. It was a very dangerous time. The Watergate special prosecutor sent Ford a letter saying that Nixon, now as a private citizen, was going to be investigated, certainly indicted, tried, almost certainly convicted, because there was such overwhelming evidence, testimony from his aides and his secret tape recordings. And so Ford said to me, so we were going to have 2 or 3 more years of Watergate. And he said the country could not stand it. We had to move on. And he said in this very plaintive, I believe truthful way, I needed my own presidency. We needed to move on. And so then he said, he pardoned Nixon, not for Nixon, not for himself, but for the national interest. He said, I had to, sitting in that seat with that constitutional power, we needed to move on. We needed to get beyond the Nixon presidency. So I wrote in Shadow that, in fact, what this being a corrupt act was a very gutsy thing that Ford did. And after the book came out, Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the late John F. Kennedy, president, her father, called me up and said she and her uncle, Teddy Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts, had read this and agreed. And that they were going to give the Profiles in Courage Award to Gerald Ford for pardoning Richard Nixon, an annual award given at the Kennedy Library for somebody who didn't play the political game in their own interest, but found a way to assess what the larger national interest is and act on that. So several months later at the Kennedy Library, and I remember watching this, there was Teddy Kennedy saying, giving this award to Gerald Ford because he broke frame because he found a way to figure out what the country needed, not what the interest group needed, not what he needed, not what his party needed, but what the country needed. And that is in the tradition of, Teddy Kennedy said, of his brother's book, Profiles in Courage. And there was Gerald Ford standing there, receiving that award, beaming, somewhat vindicated in history. And I watched this, and what a deep, humbling experience, because I was so sure in 1974 that this was the ultimate corrupt act. And then you look at it through the neutral lens of research and history and time, and what looked to be this turns out to be exactly the opposite. And I think that happens time and time again in our politics and our history. And for somebody who tries to deal with it at the moment, it's very sobering to see that what looks to be certainly this way may not be that way at all. I could go through other presidents, and maybe they will come up questions, but the lesson there is, and we see it more and more in our media today, driven by this impatience and speed and tweeting and blogs and the polarized cable television talk shows, that everything is rushed, everything is judgmental, and maybe those judgments and the facts as presented are just not right at all. And it's hard to get the moment right when it's happening, but you have to try. But sometimes you just don't get it right. Real quickly, after I've written one of my books, for all of them have been published by Simon & Schuster, the head of Simon & Schuster took me to dinner in New York. And I thought, wow, this is great. The boss is taking me to dinner. And we sat down and he said, okay, what's your next book going to be? And I said, well, I'm going to do some reading and thinking and reporting. And he said, what? Why are you going to waste your time? I said, well, that's what we try to do. He said, no. You're one of our authors. We need to know what the next book is. We are in the marketing business, in the product delivery business. And he's one of these people, you may know people like this, you may have parents like this who just grind on you. And for 2.5 hours, he's grinding on, what about doing this? What about doing that? And I didn't agree at any point to do any of the subjects, but he's grinding away. So finally, near the end of the dinner, I said, I figured out what my next book is going to be. He said, oh, good, at last. What's it going to be? And I said, my next book will be an expose of the publishing business in New York City. And he said, that's great. And I said, what? You think that's great? And he said, yes. In fact, I have a great title for that book. I said, I don't think there are any great titles left. He said, there's one. I said, what? And he said, your book, your expose on the publishing business in New York City will be called My Last Book. And he really meant it. And it may be the only sincere thing he said. If you look at the list of books I've written, I'm not there yet, but I'll get there someday. And of course, the point there is no one likes to be looked at and thoroughly. No one wants somebody to do an in-depth investigation of them and what they did and what their business is. But that's what, in my view, we need more of, particularly in this hurry-up news environment. I'm going to stop there so we can do questions. I think Gordon Liddy has provided microphones. See, you're too young. You don't know who Gordon Liddy was. Or is. He was one of the people very strongly involved in Watergate. So we're going to